Hello, everyone. Welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Noah Mintz. I'm the event coordinator at the bookstore, and Community is celebrating over 50 years in business, and we credit the continued support of readers and writers for this milestone, so thank you for spending the evening with us. I'm thrilled today to welcome Sara Freeman and Lillith Assadi for a joint celebration of their newest books, Tides and The Stars Are Not Yet Bells, respectively. Some housekeeping before I introduce our guests. We've enabled Zoom's auto transcribe settings, so if your version of Zoom is up to date, hit the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen to enable closed captions. If you have any questions for tonight's guests, please click on the Q&A button, also on the bottom of your screen, to submit them. We will be asking those at the end of the program, so please don't be shy. There's also a chat box through which I will be posting a link to buy tonight's books if you haven't already. And one caveat for tonight is that we're all at the mercy of our home internet connections, so please bear with any technical issues that might arise. We'll try to solve them quickly. We have a great lineup of events planned for you here at Community Bookstore, so head over to our website, communitybookstore.net, and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. One that I want to point out in particular is on Saturday, February 19th. We're thrilled to welcome Nobel laureate Olga Tokarczuk and Booker International Prize winning translator Jennifer Croft for The Books of Jacob in conversation with Rabi El-Amadine. That program is up on our website now and taking registrations. So now a little about tonight's guests, and we'll get started. Sara Freeman is a Montreal-born writer currently based out of Boston. She graduated from Columbia University with an MFA in fiction in 2013. At Columbia, she won the Henfield Prize for the best piece of short fiction by a graduate student. Her work has previously been published in a number of literary magazines. Lillith Assadi teaches fiction at the Columbia University School of the Arts. Her first novel, Sonora, received the Rosenthal Family Foundation Award in Literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and was a finalist for the PEN Robert W. Bingham Prize for debut fiction. In 2018, she was named a National Book Foundation 535 honoree. Her second novel, The Stars Are Not Yet Bells, was recently published by Riverhead Books. She lives with her family here in Brooklyn, New York. So without any further ado, I will hand it off to you both. Sara, Hannah, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Noah, for having us. So I'll start by reading a little bit. I don't think the excerpt needs much introduction. One character will emerge, and his name is Paul, and he's the brother of the protagonist. For years, she had the premonition that Paul would die before her. Baby brother, perfect shadow. He was too good for survival, too precious for time. When they crossed the street, she moved around him so she'd be the first one hit. When he fell asleep, she monitored his breathing. When they rode in their mother's car, she forced him into the back seat. But later, when he was an adult and still alive, still stalked by good fortune, she realized it was an idea she'd borrowed, a hand-me-down from the Salvation Army of false mythologies, from that storehouse of all foreboding, her mother's bleak and singular mind. She remembers her mother grabbing his little boy frame, pressing it against her own frailty. I know you're going to break my heart. I just don't know how. It is December now. Nobody has come to save her. The fact solidifies beneath her, a layer of black ice under every thought. In the library, she moves on to a book on pointillism, Seurat, Signac, Cross. Oil paints are de rigueur in this novel technique, she reads. The thick texture allows for less bleeding, blurring, running. She enjoys one of the Seurats most, the quiet repose of boys lounging on the bank of their dotted river. She turns the page, a self-portrait of Chuck Close, which she draws near to her nose and then pushes away. He died once, Paul, but only for a few minutes. They had been sent to camp that year, the summer of their father's desertion. There was a drill one morning, an announcement made over the intercom. A camper is missing, a camper is missing. Hundreds of children buzzing around the flagpole. Nervous laughter, a child missing, a child dead. These seemed like funny matters back then. Children didn't die. Even Mara laughed into her cupped hand, picturing something so absurd, adults letting this kind of thing happen to a child. She looked around for Paul. Even here, he was always nearby, always within arm's reach, her shadow. And then a fact before it becomes one. He was the missing child, the dead child. His name, Paul, on all the children's lips. She wanted them to stop saying it. It was her name to say. If one more person says it, she thought, that's it, he's dead. And then there was talk of the docks, swimming, the camp counselors, tanned saints, sex incarnate, diving in, one after the other, bathing suits splintering red against the dark lake. The sound of a whistle and then another and another, a deafening orchestra of channeled breath. They carried him out on a stretcher. It was him, only dead. She went straight to the body and had at it, hitting it on the shoulder and across the face. And then a smile appeared, his, cheering from the other children, his teeth laughing, oversized in his mouth, crowded at the front. It was just a drill, Mara, a voice trying to calm her down from above, but she wasn't done. She took her hands to his neck, pressed her weight into the tender flesh until the counselors had to pry the siblings apart. For weeks afterwards, she refused to look at him. She understood just what her mother had meant with her broken refrain, what he could do to them, what he could take.
I don't know what you're supposed to do with Zoom. Do you want to just tell us the one line about the book? I feel like,
Sure.
yeah, now, and then I have a related question to the excerpt. And to everybody who's here, I'm going to ask Sarah some questions, and then I'll read, and she'll ask me some questions, and we'll talk to all of you. So anyway, so to give us, the line.
So for those people who haven't read the book yet, no, I'm just kidding. For those people who haven't read the book, it really is a story, kind of an aftermath story, the story of a woman who leaves her family behind, her hometown, after a sort of intimate loss that we don't really find out the nature of until later in the novel. She ends up in a seaside town at the tail end of summer and sort of slowly builds something like a life there and begins to piece together what happened to her to a certain extent.
Yeah, that's great. And I think so. This excerpt revolves around Paul, right? And the relationship with Paul. And I think the first question I want to ask is actually related kind of from laterally. So dreams play a bigger and bigger role in the narration of this book as like sort of in the final third. They kind of accelerate and accumulate, and particularly where I would say content-wise, the relationship between Paul, and Mara is concerned. Some things are revealed about their relationship vis-a-vis dreams, or at least the way she feels maybe about their relationship vis-a-vis dreams. And I wondered kind of like your decision to use dreams in that way. I personally love dreams, and sometimes I feel like I get pushed back editorially for using them. So your decision to use them, whether or not you received sort of pushback in your decision to use them, and like how you feel about dreams, like using dreams to kind of further plot in fiction in general.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're the first person to ask me about dreams, and in one of the sort of like earliest drafts of this sort of the book as in its kind of current shape, I had so many dreams. I mean, this book was like most of the important psychic work of the book was happening at the level of dreams. And I had two very critical readers. One first reader who was like, I can't get to the character because the dreams are so, they're almost like repeating the themes of the book, which I felt was really important because she's so obsessive, and I wanted her to be both experiencing things and dreaming about them in this like kind of recursive way. But then, so that first reader, I was like, I don't agree. But then I did have another reader who I really trusted kind of make the argument that the character we did need a little bit more of just the kind of danger of her situation, which was more alive in the present than maybe it was in the dreams.
Mhm.
And so I was I went through the dreams and tried to find the ones that felt the most revealing, and also the ones that felt like they brought it in an image that maybe I wasn't already recycling in some other way, in some other description. So I definitely thought about the dreams a lot, and I was, at the same time as being edited, I was heavily influenced by, I listened to an interview with Edna O'Brien at one point where she talks about her book, The Little Red Chairs, which I really love. And it has a lot of kind of psychology revealed through the dreams. And
Mhm.
she sort of made the point, like, these characters are characters who are basically traumatized. And one of the only ways to sort of realistically render them and render their interiority, if they're not the kinds of people who are constantly talking about their interiority, was through this slightly indirect dream world. And so I thought, if like Edna O'Brien can do it, maybe I could do it a little bit. And I'm glad that I didn't remove all the dreams, because I think what you're talking about is like the MFA
Yeah.
recommendation, which is like, this has no energy, this is not like action, this is not, it's fluffy. I mean, is that what your experience?
Oh, I mean, I feel like was told over and over again, and I feel, yeah, I've had the same experience, right, where probably the majority of a plot or whatever, a majority of a narrative was a dream or a dreamscape, and told to kind of, and I feel like in my first book that was much more of a thing, right? I think their dreams dominated quite a bit, and then I had to come back and kind of figure out how to make them shine, right, against the other landscapes that maybe were needed. I still debate it, but I love the use of it here. So I was just curious.
Yeah, I don't, you talk about the dream with her brother. I never would have wanted that to be a confession, because in fact, it isn't a confession.
It's a dream.
It's a dream. And it's like it's such a good, it's that space, that subconscious, unconscious, I don't know exactly which one, space that feels like dangerous, but it's not real, right? And I think that's like a fun place to be in fiction.
Definitely. It's revealing of their intimacy in the way that's so, that only a dream can do, right? It's not actually confessing anything about the two of them. It's so interesting because it exposes so much and at the same time. So anyway, I kudos. I'm happy that, you've used them. And I feel in good company now. So yeah. My second question, and it's, I think place is deeply embedded in this book, right? There's a way in which the story of this book can't be extricated from the town in which it's set. It starts out with this character boarding a bus into town, and without revealing the end, I will just say that it doesn't leave this place, right? For its duration, right? It's intimately connected to this place. So I wondered, one, sort of maybe what inspiration, what was the inspiration for this particular place? And two, sort of, did you ever imagine it being set elsewhere, and perhaps an elsewhere that was not seaside? Like, was there another landscape that this story could have been set, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think from the very beginning, she was in a room by the sea. And I think that's like an idea that is so, it's a trope for sure in literature. And I've been thinking a bit about just speaking to a friend about this book, The Sea, Iris Murdoch's like totally different kind of book, but I think that setting was very much in my mind. Also a book I've read many times that is, in many ways very conventional, but that like embedded itself in my mind was Anne Tyler's Ladder of Years, which actually isn't set by the sea, but she leaves the sea and goes to a small town. And so I always imagine it by the sea. Anyways, all this to say, I had this it needed to be by the sea, certainly. But I think what ended up happening is that at the beginning, I wasn't sure how much the sea itself would be part of the like currents of the narrative, and the two, the kind of the character and then also the place, ended up kind of developing alongside one another, so that I started to feel like I didn't need to like be describing the sea and her relationship to the sea all the time, but that everything in the way the book was being shaped, you know, where the paragraphs were, how much white space there was, her kind of like her thoughts, this kind of push and pull of desire, past and present, was all so maritime,
Yeah.
that it no longer felt like the setting influenced her. It was like all happening kind of at once in some way, in some synchronized fashion.
Yeah, and there's just something inherently sad. I mean, most of this story takes place off season, right? And there's just something inherently sad about these, and beautiful. And I prefer it, these places almost in the off season, but that sort of matches her sense of both. I mean, she had, I'm not revealing anything by saying she's abandoned everything, right?
Yeah.
So her sense of abandon and desertion. So there is a way in which they sort of inform one another. Was there any specific town, though, just out of curiosity, that you went to like just sort of take notes? Or
I mean, there are a few that
there's
are
a few.
very,
Okay.
very.
Because I want to go there. I want to go to one.
I don't know why I feel so protective of this town.
No. Yeah.
It's,
if you don't want to say. But.
No, it's just, it was certainly New England seaside towns, and
Yeah.
this kind of accumulated sort of familiarity with this feeling of these places that do have, you know, one of everything, like the co-op and the bar, and how like both more themselves and less themselves they are in the off season. And
Yeah,
I did, you know, I think it was actually like one of the challenges was trying to make it a real place, but that could also be like a mythic place, which I actually think will be really interesting to talk about for your book, because I feel like you're toggling between, you know, a real place that can be
in every place. Yeah.
And in every place. And it has been a really nice surprise. I think I've noticed that people in different places are like, that's like that town that I, you know.
You've never been to, yeah.
Right. Like in Florida. And I'm like, okay, yeah, that's obviously not what I was picturing, but.
Yeah, sure.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, it felt very real, you know, like, and mythic. And I think the ocean just lends itself to that. And her situation feels so mythical that, you know, like, but the place itself felt like a place on a map, you know?
Right.
And that wine store, I was just like, damn, that seems like a good wine store. Sometimes those are hard to find in towns like that. So maybe that's why I asked too. But
I'll tell you later, Hannah.
Yeah, tell me later. Okay, so my final question is, this is a story that deals, you know, in tragedy, even though it's sort of off the page, right? It's not kind of, I mean, one of the most impressive things and the most beautiful things about this book is its restraint, right? It's not sort of indulging in the tragedy or in melodrama. And but I did wonder, but there is this tragedy that has happened, right? And I wondered, for you as a fiction writer, sort of like how you deal with inhabiting a character's tragedy that you have not experienced. I know you haven't, right? Because we've talked about this. And how do you kind of separate yourself from the tragedy? Does it spook you out? Like, are you able to, maybe, is it cathartic somehow? Like, yeah, just like, how do you deal with it?
Yeah, it's funny. I have been thinking about that. I've obviously thought about it as I was writing it. Definitely, there's something cathartic about writing about something that might scare you.
Yeah.
And also writing a character who isn't you, but who might be sort of like an extreme, amped up version of yourself. I mean, I think that was helpful in that I never had a moment where I was like, I can't relate to this at all. I have never had this thought, you know. I felt
Sure.
like I was in, she was you know, she was sort of like, she was in my peripheral vision psychically, like not so far that I couldn't relate to also the things that had happened to her. And I do think, like, as women, we are often in conversation with each other about intimate losses. And I felt like, in a way, I was creating a portrait of someone who was very familiar to me, either because I'd known her or because it was like some version of myself. And yeah, I mean, kind of like with the place, the setting, I did also want her tragedy, or the bad thing that happens to her, to be real, in that, you know, it had like the quality of something that could happen to someone. It wasn't like aggrandized or put on some kind of pedestal. But I also wanted to think, like, how is it that this person would deal with this tragedy? And for Mara, what she experiences, I saw as part of a long kind of history of loss, not just like the one singular loss. And I think that was helpful, because it wasn't like, this is her tragedy with a capital T. It was really trying to understand what it was like for this person to have this happen to her, and what it meant to her, rather than like some idea I have about trauma, or like women facing certain kinds of losses, if that makes sense.
Totally. It's like a constellation of Mara and like her losses, but this one, you know, a black hole in the center of it or something like that. It's beautifully done. So I think about that. I just think about this question a lot, and I always like to hear, how do we do it? And, how do we do justice to it? And
how do you do it sensitively, but also not stay away from things that are difficult because you're so afraid that you'll mishandle them?
Yeah.
You know?
You're inhabiting a sensitive place, right? Yeah, but in order to do it, you really have to go there. And it's just an interesting question.
I think in yourself, like, I think if there's nothing at stake for you, that might also be an indication this is not the material for you. Like, I felt very affected by what was happening to this character in a way that maybe wasn't always that healthy. So
Well, now it's over. So.
Thanks, Hannah.
But yeah.
And with that in mind,
Well, before we go to me, I just want to say to everybody, because I won't have it, this is such a beautiful book. I hope you will, if you haven't bought it already. I hope you will. And I just finished it last night, totally floored, called Sara, like, holy shit. So anyway, thank you. Sarah, I don't know, you're letting me read now, I guess, right?
I am letting you read. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for letting me read. I'm going to actually, so I will tell you briefly now, just a brief bit about the book. And I think I'm going to read from the very beginning. So hopefully it won't need more introduction than that. But this is a story about a woman who has a form of dementia. And as her mind starts to sort of slip, she both begins to kind of indulge or live inside of an old love, her first love, and also these sort of magical and strange blue lights begin to appear on the island where she has lived for most of her life, in a way that's both beautiful but also maybe a little bit problematic. So I think that's all you need to know. But I'm also reading the beginning, so hopefully it'll be clear enough. Okay. 1. It is not yet the end. Moss descends from the oaks, thick as curtains, veiling the night's secrets from the living. A wild mare and her foal are out to feed before the dawn. Seagulls bark their hunger at the sky, and Lyra, our island, remains above the sea. The ocean has not engulfed all this, even though I have woken from that dream I've had again and again over the decades. In last night's rendering, after the island had burned and sunken into the waters, and all the stars had fallen into the Atlantic, I could still swim. and beneath the surface, wandering among the blue constellations like a mermaid, at last I found Gabriel. 2. But it is not the story of a drowned ghost haunting my dreams that Dr. Madeira wants from me. He says I must focus on the facts. Dr. Madeira has commanded that I report the story of myself, the real story, every morning. Should I get lost, he has offered me helpful mnemonic exercises. What is your age? What is your name? Where do you live? What year is it? Who is your husband? What are the names of your children? What is the weather like today? The wind smells of rain. My name is El Rainier. It is May the 13th, 1997. A voice talks at me from the radio, telling me that the market has turned for the worse. The Israelis and Palestinians are at war. Snow falls late in the north. The broadcast makes it sound as if the world is finally ending. I no longer tremble at signs of the apocalypse, since my own was prophesied for me in a fluorescent medical office some time ago. At the start of the Second World War, I moved from New York City to Lyra, population 400, most of whom until these last years were employed by my husband, Simon. We have lived since then on this strip of sand, woolly with oak, off the coast of southern Georgia. The dunes here shimmer, white as snow. Wild horses roam, ancient and unapproachable as unicorns. Storms trample us in this part of the world. We are the midwife of the ocean's wrath. Hurricanes have ravaged my garden many times over. Until this year, I have always been able to revive my rose bushes. Our home was built on the foundation of a previous one, which was built on the foundation of one before that. Both houses burned to the ground a century apart. The island has never wanted us. Back in 41, the three of us, Gabriel, Simon, and I, had anchored at the dock on the riverside rather than the oceans, where the irreverent tangle of oak recalls the woods of some fairy tale. I knew even then that I'd become lost in them. The path to the house was scarcely marked by an ancient sandy trail. There's only ever been the one dirt road carving its way through the island, from the town in the south to the northern settlement. Our house stood on Lyra's highest ground, right in the middle. It was Elijah, at first the groundskeeper and later Simon's ship watch leader, who guided us to our new habitat, which stank of earth and ocean and fire. We were city people and startled by the sound of our own feet crushing the leaves beneath us. But it was not the land itself that would curtail our welcome. Once the house was before us, I gazed at it in awe. The stone stairways rising into a menagerie of vines, veiling more windows than I could count. The ground so spacious that a wild horse gnawing on the lawn seemed the size of a dog. Even the light overhead was of a different quality, more persistent in its splendor. I wondered to myself how a person would not go missing in such a place. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's such a beautiful opening. And it does actually kind of contain some of what I'm interested in asking you about. So one of the things that I found really pretty remarkable about the book is how much time is actually contained within it. Like there really is Elle's entire lifetime in this book. And particularly those kind of 50 years, between her getting married and kind of, becoming elderly and having dementia. And I'm wondering how, one of the things that you do is you show us many of these moments in her life. At the same time, there's a sense of like incredible fluidity in the way time is rendered. And so I guess I'm kind of wondering how you thought of time and also how you kind of managed this shape what that process was for you as you were writing.
Yeah, I think in some ways I feel like the structure or in like the sense of time, right, both kind of being implicated in the other, like came to me more almost in revision, and a way in which like the first draft of this book, which I had actually looked over recently just because it was in my Google Docs and it came up, was very much just like a voice, right, and her voice, and which came to me in a way that was almost like felt a little supernatural, because it's like, this is obviously not an autobiographical story, and so in a way the story sort of came through me, and yes, it's inspired by my grandmother, but so that was almost like the first thrust of it, and it was very much focused in that first draft, and I think it's retained, in the published book. Is very much focused on almost like two time periods, right? Like one is the Gabriel time period, and one is this latter time period as things are kind of really coming undone for her. And then like later I realized, like, both from very helpful feedback from my editor and other, very smart readers, that, like more time needed to kind of like be represented here, right? This is a whole life. And there were moments of it, but certainly like there are decades involved in this life. And so there's a way in which I sort of had to, fill in sort of time gaps later, but the way that I did that always sort of related back to this like shining period, right? So there was a way in which it's almost like, and I feel like this isn't so untrue. I think there are just periods in life that feel more shiny, right? Like they define us more, or they hold more weight or more gravity or something. And certainly for this character, I knew it had to be this period of time where she made this decision to not be with Gabriel, which I hopefully doesn't reveal too much, but and that's her like shining period, and almost every other period of time feels like a branch coming out of it. And I think that's the way I like structured all the other periods, so that you're like, you fall into them by way of like coming from that period in the late 30s with Gabriel, right? Like you fall into the 60s then, and then you fall into the 70s, but they're all this kind of outgrowth of that first period of time in her life. And then of course there's the dissolution that's happening in the present. So it was more like a tree than like anything linear or like chronological, I think, structurally. And I don't really know how to say that like how do you, I don't know. It wasn't always completely conscious, but in the end with revision, I figured out how to like hopefully clean it up.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense, because it does feel like the structure. I'm like very interested in how the structure of a novel can like really deeply relate to the interiority of the character. And I feel like this, to think of it as all emanating or sort of like glowing around these shiny parts of her consciousness or what is remembered, is really, it makes sense, because it does feel like it's kind of pulsing, like that the shape is, it's like growing and sort of like then receding, and it's really beautiful. And it actually is like quite heartening to hear that happened in revision, because it feels very organic to the story.
I feel like the early drafts, right, are just like two periods of time in a way, and it may be fluidly moving back and forth in a way that like wasn't as conscious as other things I've read, but certainly filling in that feeling, that sweep of time, was something I had to sort of really think about, and like how would it work without it deflating too much of like the urgency of what you're trying to figure out, which is what happened with Gabriel.
Yeah, I think it's really beautifully done. And the fact that you have these like sentences that like swell kind of makes it all feel very fluid. Yeah, it's really beautiful. So this is a bit of an extension of this, because I feel like memory and time are so crucial to this story. You're dealing with a character who has dementia, but on the other hand, she's so full of memories. And I'm wondering how you decided, or how you, and in a way you've sort of answered this, but how you worked through what she would remember and what she would forget. And I felt particularly, and I don't think this is giving very much away, particularly moved and troubled by the fact that in her current state, she really cannot recognize her son, and she really forgets him as her son, whereas her daughter remains very alive to her. I'm curious about that decision, and in general, how you sort of manage that logic of remembering and forgetting.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like just from hearing stories and observing people with this form of memory loss, this illness, right? There's a way in which, for whatever reason, like figures and memories from the distant past feel much, or sort of get a lot more representation, like in elder age. And, you know, I probably at some point I did the research on that, but I don't quite, understand. I couldn't tell you why now that is the case scientifically, but I did want to represent that, right? Like that these early memories still feel clear and vibrant and almost like she's reliving them, right? In a way that the circumstances of her present are just like very vague. Like she has no idea what's happening to Simon's business. She has no idea that they're so financially, they're in such financial trouble that they're going to have to leave the island. Like she really can't face, is it that she can't face those circumstances, or she's just really can't remember? Like her short-term memory is just not working. And I wanted to play with that ambiguity a little bit. Like, she's also suffered from some form of mental illness her whole life. So is it like there's a kind of a blurry line between her dementia and her depression. But I do feel like the farther we go in life, and I'm not, I'm representing an experience that I can't really speak to, but I do feel like the older I get, the harder it is to understand like how I've gotten to where I am. Like I keep having to go back to these like early memories, or memories from 15 or 20 years ago, to figure out like, oh yeah, that's how this happened and that's how I got here. In some ways I feel like that's what she's doing. So the memories that are clear are the ones that were pivotal, like in shaping her life. And then in terms of, Raymond was always, like from his first appearance on the page, he was always the character she was going to forget. And at first I didn't even really know who he was. Like I didn't know if he was a business associate of Simon's, and then eventually he's her son, right? Even to me, it was something I discovered in writing it. And I think it does make sense, right? But I always knew there was to be this character intimate to the family and to her that she just couldn't recognize, right? And I felt that was really important. And eventually I realized, even in writing it, right, that he's her son with Simon, right? And part of her inability to recognize him is part of maybe her inability to recognize her relationship, right?
Mm-hmm.
Her husband, and how profound that relationship has been. And in lieu of like contending with that, she's focused, and I'm sort of obsessed with the Gabriel memory, right? Sort of an escapist, sort of like the blue lights, which are both beautiful, but also removing her from her reality even more, right? So anyway, I think they're all, Raymond sort of reflects that trend.
Yeah, I think it was really sort of tragic and nicely done, because it does reflect also my experience of being with people who have this kind of memory loss, that they're sort of stuck in an affect and stuck in a kind of remembering that is like hard to sort of, it's just so sort of contained in some way. And something about this, like forgetting your own son, just it really spoke to this character's like sense of loss, I think. I guess another thing that, I mean, you asked me, and I think is really like so much part of this book too, and in some way the books connect, is the way in which the character and setting are so intimately linked. And I truly can't imagine this book not being set on Lyra. And even in this opening section that you read, it's like the place is so much a character in the novel. And alongside Elle's disintegration, there's also this kind of economic disintegration of Lyra. And the place is also kind of, you know, undergoing a transformation. And I'm wondering, as you were writing, if it really was this character that emerged first, or if you always knew she would be in this place, and why this place?
So the character emerged first, and I get definitely like inspired by, although not, directly based on my grandmother, who was a New Yorker and lived in the South in a small town in Alabama. But it was important to me that the story I was writing was set by the ocean. And I think very early, though the character came first, very early, I was looking for sort of like a place on the same latitude generally as where my grandparents lived, but on the ocean. And I came across like internet research, thanks Google, Cumberland Island, and I'm okay to name it. We went and my partner and I camped there in very cold weather before we were parents. One December, about 5 years ago or something. It was freezing even for that part of the South at that time of year. But anyway, it was beautiful. And it's a place where the Carnegies had their like winter residence, and but like abandoned kind of like as soon as their kind of time in the limelight was over. I mean, not that the money is gone, and they still run a hotel there, but there was a way in which it's sort of like economic rise and fall is kind of like inherently connected to the island itself in reality. And also that house, Dungeness, that they built there burned down in the 50s. And there was another house on that same site that burned down. So like the passage I read, that's like a true fact, something like haunted or cursed maybe about this land. And now, I mean, it's in the news again, which is really interesting because it sort of like echoes, so at least thematically, some of the economic or financial things I was talking about. But now there's like a spaceport being built, or they're threatening to build it on the mainland. And it's like there's a lot of protests going on because it can, like, this is wilderness preserve, and rockets going over it will obviously threaten a lot of the species there. But then of course it will also provide lots of jobs to people on the mainland if it is built. So it's this like sort of interesting conflict where technology and economics and the economic future of that like sort of territory kind of collide. So it's anyway, so there's a real place it was based on. And then I had to kind of like form it to the vision I wanted, which there was always going to be, or I wanted there to be, this kind of magical element, right? This sort of way in which she was allowed to escape. And I actually like meant for it to be sort of hopeful, despite maybe being a little bit problematic, that there was this other realm that she had access to that no one else did. And I wanted the island to sort of provide that and be connected to it. And also be connected to Simon's business. So there's a way in which a reader could interpret it literally, and also another reader could come to it and interpret it metaphorically or even magically. So I feel like the place is very important to the book as well, but it was secondary, which is different than my first book.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because as I was saying, this place is disintegrating, Elle is disintegrating. I think one of the things that is really amazing about it, and you talk about the kind of magic, but I also think it's that she's still very connected to beauty and to the beauty of the place. And there's something that remains quite very alive about her observations. And I think the place kind of helps to make that feel feel true. It's so full of life in some ways, you know, all of your descriptions of nature and yeah, and this kind of incredibly full setting.
Thank you. Yeah, I wouldn't mind living in a place like that. I hope like we create like the places that don't exist that we want to live in for a while.
Yeah, this definitely has that
yeah.
quality. Absolutely. And
okay, should we? I answer.
oh, yes,
you have anything else?
No,
for me?
no, I was actually just. Oh, the only thing I wanted to say was, I think just the first, like this opening section gives everyone a sense of just how lush and beautiful this book is, and read it. It's also a very beautiful cover, which I think we need to celebrate our pretty covers.
Yeah, no, I know they did a nice.
They did a good job.
Thanks, art department. Yeah, they're really nice. I'm sorry I have the galley and actually, ironically enough, it has water damage, which is maybe appropriate because my daughter spilled water on it, but it was still readable. Anyway, yeah. So maybe should we answer questions from the audience and then we can answer that joint question that we have.
That would be great.
Okay. Let's see. I think maybe the first one is for you, right? I'll ask it out loud so that, and then often in your sentences, words repeat throughout the book. Certain whole phrases recur obsessionally to your protagonist, and then there are much deeper repetitions, which cycle both through the text and the character. How do you think about the relationship between writing and repeating?
That's a really, I like that question a lot. I mean, certainly the book, I was very interested in someone who is repeating herself to herself, not only in terms of remembering like bits of language and almost like a track she can't get rid of. And I thought of that not only like in terms of language, but also just in terms of herself, you know, these types of behaviors or thoughts that she just can't get out from, and that she keeps returning to. So that was like, in terms of building the character, repetition was, you know, she just cannot stop making the same mistakes, which I think many of us can relate to. I'm here again doing the same thing I said I wouldn't do. How did that happen? And then in terms of writing, I mean, it is such an iterative process that I do think I was like painstakingly repeating certain sentences to myself to see if they like had, I don't know, if they were full, if they had power. But it's a good question. I actually think I would have to continue to think about it. Yeah, a great question.
Yeah, that's good, right? It's like you tapped into something I'm thinking about.
I'm going to continue to think about that. Should I ask you, Hannah, one of your questions?
Sure. Yeah, I think, and the second one's for you too. But if you want to, yeah, we can back and forth. You can ask me Thomas' question.
Yeah, exactly. Hi, Hannah. You mentioned your grandmother as a source of inspiration. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. Hi, Tamra. Thank you for this question, and thanks, Sarah, for asking it. My grandmother, I've never really knew her. I mean, I had met her once when I was 2, my maternal grandmother, but I always heard stories about her. And by the time I met her, and I was too young to have a real memory of her, she was quite sick. But shortly before starting this novel, I had been working on other things, and I eventually abandoned them, which Sarah and I may get to talk about our all the things we abandoned when we find our project. I had come across this picture, this photo of her with a man, but I didn't know who he was. You know, my mother didn't know who he was. I asked my great aunt, who passed in April of 2020 at 100 years old, who he was. She didn't know who she wouldn't say who he was. It seemed like she knew, right? And so there's this interesting mystery of like that a whole life can go by, you know, with a secret that somebody has about somebody, right? And in the photo, she just looks quite happy and quite in love. And I think I had heard many of the stories I heard about her was that she was always not so happy and maybe not so in love with my grandfather, actually vice versa. So it was this interesting, so it just sort of set me on a journey, thinking about her and thinking about, I've always been in, you know, I think as a writer, I'm primarily interested in memory, time, and mortality. And I thought like, wow, like how interesting would it be to write of these things that I'm usually interested in from the perspective of somebody with dementia. So that gave me these sort of, and which she had Alzheimer's, my grandmother. So anyway, that's sort of how she lit the fuse, as it were.
Yeah, I think it never gets old, the family secret. You know, it's like you can't these like parts of our relatives' lives that are like right there, nearly at our fingertips. It's like it's just such good material.
Yeah. It's like write what you don't know, but you kind of know somewhere there. Okay, I'm gonna ask you Karen's question. Greetings from Ontario. I'm halfway through your novel and can't wait to get back to it after the event. I'm wondering how you decided to use the third person to tell Mara's story and if you experimented with first at all. It feels first person, though it isn't, which is quite an accomplishment. That's such a great question. I wondered the same. Yeah.
Karen, you caught me. I did write this in the first person. And that was the first draft was in the first person. And then I think with, you know, once I had put the first draft aside and I returned to it, I felt like I wanted it to be even more sort of dislocated. And at the beginning of the book, Mara is so sort of in a fugue state, really. I felt like the third person, especially the third person present, both felt like the first person, but with more of this kind of like distanced, aphasic kind of quality. And it just, it felt right in terms of her psychology. So yes, you caught me. It wasn't the first person, but
brave of you to switch it. It works beautifully. I agree, but yeah, it feels first. Yeah, it's interesting. You manage it so well. Okay. You want to read this one, Sarah? Should I?
Yeah. And Hannah, thank you for your lovely reading. You spoke beautifully about discovering parts of the story while writing. How do you think about the relationship between writing and remembering? Is there a tension for you between constructing a fictional world and recalling a real lived experience? Or is there an alignment for you, given that both activity usually end somewhere unexpected?
What a beautiful question. The tension between writing and remembering. Yeah, I feel like, you know, it's interesting because in this book recently published, it's not my memories to remember, and yet the way it sort of came out of me almost was like that, maybe because I had received so many stories about my grandmother, and so I was able to like remember, but I had to fictionalize because it wasn't, you know, like as I was remembering, right? And so in a way there was like less tension than usual when I write, because I feel like so much of my writing is in its first instance on the page is trying to figure out something that happened for me, like in my life, right? And then I find a way that like maybe fictionalizing it actually helps me figure it out or contend with it or deal with it better than even what happened, right? By building it out into a world that isn't this one, like I can somehow see it better, and maybe hopefully a reader can too. But this one was so interesting. It was just such a different experience because it wasn't in any way related to my story. But perhaps I think, like Sarah said earlier, there's some way in which this character's life still has some residue of me, right? And maybe it's that first love thing, or that shining part of youth that I, that and some of the, difficult parts of that as well that happened that I can't get over somehow. And maybe that for me is what I was writing into. I don't know. But certainly typically it begins with what I know. And then from there, a fictional world kind of takes off on its own organically. That's, I think, tends to be my process. I don't know if that really answers the question, but anyway.
I think it does beautifully.
Stacy,
I know we're like keeping the best for last.
Yeah.
Stacy is the very, very wonderful reader teacher who helped me to remove the right dreams. So
oh, okay. Yeah. Stacy, I feel like taught me so much, both of our professor during our MFA. Yeah. And I still remember on beauty, it was like the seminar I feel like I took my first semester. Were you in that?
I wasn't.
Okay.
I really regret that.
Okay,
honestly.
Anyway, inform me so much, but also everything else, every other topic. So, okay, question. You want to answer this? Could you talk what it's like to publish during endless being the imperative word here, pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, it's my first book, right? And I think so we've had slightly different experiences of it. I feel a sense of loss that I haven't been able to meet people, readers in person, booksellers, my, conversation partners. And yet I'm also so happy that this is happening online, because it also means more people can attend from like all parts of life. But there is a kind of irreality, I think, to publishing at the moment. And there probably always is, because you're so alone and then you're suddenly presenting this thing to many people, and it's exposing and strange. But it does feel more unreal maybe than I think it might if I was going from city to city, which I think you described a little bit, Hannah, that when you're with your first book, you were going to bookstores and meeting people. And
yeah, I mean, I wasn't going to city, but I had a few cities, and I got to go to California, which I think was the nicest part of all. But and also, in my hometown in Arizona too. But there was a way in which like the travel and the actual like physically moving your body like to a different space to talk about your book made it lent it this sort of excitement that you just can't have. Like even if this were taking place at Community Bookstore in Brooklyn, there would be an energy to having bodies around us and like people to talk to afterward. And we're just going to press end or leave actually in a few minutes. And like, it's less tiring, but I think it's also, I think there's something lost, I really do. And at the same time, I think about like, writer, like, for book launches always happening. No, that's like a recent phenomenon. So like presumably like William Faulkner like didn't have a book launch. Like what did he do? I just like got drunk after, like got a call from his editor, like, yeah, out, sending a check in the mail. Like so maybe we're living a more traditional experience of it. But I think it's also been, and Sarah and I talked briefly yesterday about this, and I know we're about to wrap up, but it's not just a pandemic, it's like a different political climate than it's been in the past. I mean, like everything feels different and harder and stranger. And I think just to talk about like a beautiful seascape or dreamscape, or it seems, to me, it feels more important, but I think it maybe feels less important to others. And I think that's hard. Like that. Yeah. I'll leave it at that. Sarah, I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
I'm just very happy to have been introduced to your book at this particular time. So
same.
I'm really glad that we had this conversation. And thank you so much to Community for hosting us.
Yeah.
Thank you both. Again, I do wish we could have done this in person, but it's been such a pleasure to to have you here tonight, and all of you at home for tuning in. Thank you so much. Hopefully we can see you all in the bookstore very soon. Please do purchase a copy of Tides and the Stars Are Not Yet Bells from Community Bookstore. Sarah, Hannah, thank you again both so much for doing this. This was a fabulous conversation, and take care, everyone. Good night.
Thank
Thanks
you
so much for having us. Bye.
Bye. Thank you everyone for coming.